Play. I know most of you will be catching this on the replay. Welcome to those of you who will join live. Welcome to my channel. My name is Carmen Andrea Harris. I am the creator of pathwayforjoy.com, also known as Pathway Counseling and Wellness. I am a certified grief counselor. I am also a certified life coach and certified in inner healing. Through my service, pathwayforjoy.com, through my counseling practice, I offer grief counseling services as well as inner healing and wellness coaching. You can learn more about how I can help you on your personal journey of grief, healing, and wellness by visiting my website, pathwayforjoy.com. So for this video, we're going to be talking about normal feelings of grief. All of us have either experienced grief, we're grieving right now, or we will be grieving in the future. It's something that none of us can escape. And when we talk about grief, we're not always just talking about grieving the death of a person. Grief can come by way of the loss of a career, the loss of a friendship with someone who's still living, the loss of the idea of how a relationship may have went or how you thought it was supposed to go. So grief can come in many different shapes and forms. When we talk about grief, there's such a thing as normal grief, which is also considered or called uncomplicated grief. And then there's such a thing as complicated grief, which is considered abnormal grief, which would be prolonged, and it would come with different types of things that may be similar to depression or other pathologies or mental diseases. So for the intent of this video, we're going to be talking about normal grief. And when I talk about normal grief, I want to put it in four categories. There's typically four categories that normal grief will fall under, okay? The first one is feelings. The second one is cognitions, meaning like the things that we think in our mind. The third one is physical sensations, and the fourth one is behavioral changes. For the intent of this video, I'm going to be talking about normal feelings that are associated with normal grief. And this is for those of you who are on a personal grief journey, or for those of you who have a loved one or a friend who is grieving and they may be sharing some feelings that they're having with you, and you may be wondering, is this normal for them to feel this way? So that is the point of this video. Not only do I offer grief counseling, but on this channel, I want to serve as a grief educator to educate people on grief, the different characteristics of grief, and just different avenues of grief, because it's something that we don't typically talk about in our society. We're a very grief avoidant society. And I know that part of my job, part of my assignment is to educate people on grief. So let's get into it. Let's get into the different feelings that are associated with normal grief. So I'm going to name them, and then I'm going to go into depth with them. And don't mind my camera that just kind of went out a little bit, my light camera. So these are the 13 feelings that are associated with normal grief. This is not an all-inclusive list, okay? These are just 13 typical feelings that go along with grief. Number 1 is sadness. Number 2 is anger. Number 3 is blame. Number 4 is guilt and self-reproach. Number 5 is anxiety. Number 6 is loneliness. Number 7, hey, thank you for joining. Number 7 is fatigue. Number 8 is helplessness. Number 9 is shock. Number 10 is yearning. Number 11 is emancipation. Number 12 is relief. And number 13 is numbness. Now, I may break this video down into 2 parts because it's quite a bit of information. Thank you. Jesus loves you as well. So 13 feelings of normal grief. And again, this will probably be a 2-part video because it's a lot of information. But if you are on a personal grief journey, I just want to give you comfort in knowing that a lot of the feelings that you are having are completely normal. If you are supporting someone who is on a grief journey, whether they are grieving the death of a person that they loved, or if they are grieving a career or a friendship or a lifestyle or just anything, I want you to be able to support them. And if you're on your personal journey, I want you to be able to become educated on some of the things that you may be feeling and experiencing. So the first one, sadness. Sadness is the most common feeling found in the bereaved and those mourning a loss, okay? That's like a no-brainer. We know that for the most part, people will be sad when they are grieving, okay? Especially when they're grieving the death of a person. The second feeling is anger. Okay. A lot of people don't like to talk about the anger that they may feel when they are grieving. Anger is frequently experienced after loss, and it can be one of the most confusing feelings for the survivor. Okay. And the reason why is at the root of many problems. Anger is at the root of many problems in the grieving process, meaning that when someone is grieving and they're feeling anger, they begin to get conflicted and confused, and they kind of feel like they don't have a right to be angry. Like, how could you be angry at someone who has died and gone on? Like, how could you be angry? But that's a very real feeling and emotion. So you may be angry at whoever may have died. I remember when my late husband first died, I was angry at him. How dare he die and leave me with two daughters to raise on my own? You know, how dare he die and we still had conversations to have and we still had unresolved issues. But there was anger within me after my late husband died, but I was able to acknowledge and be real about that anger. So if you're watching this video on the replay, you may be angry at the person who died for dying and for leaving you, but you have conflicted feelings of guilt about your anger because the person didn't want to die, but they died. But that's a very real and normal emotion, the feeling of anger. And you may be thinking like, how can I be angry? But I just want you to know that if you're on a personal grief journey and you're feeling anger towards the person who died, it's a normal feeling. It's a normal emotion. Okay. Now, when you are angry when someone dies, the anger can come from two main sources. Again, this is not an all-inclusive list. This is not an end-all be-all list, but the anger typically comes from two sources. The first one is a source of frustration, a source of frustration that there was nothing that you could do to prevent the death. I personally experienced that. The second source of this anger can be a kind of regressive experience. It could be a kind of regressive experience that occurs after the loss of someone close. So in the loss of any important person, there's a tendency to, number one, regress, to kind of fall back on your progress in certain areas. There's a tendency to feel helpless. There's a tendency to feel unable to exist without the person. There's a tendency to experience the anger that goes along with the feelings of anxiety that are associated with the helplessness, the regression, and the feeling of being unable to exist without the person. Also, if you're experiencing anger, I just want to reassure you again that it is completely normal and it is okay. However, you need to identify your anger so that you can appropriately target the anger towards the deceased in order to make a healthy adaptation. You need to stop and say, okay, I'm feeling angry after the death of my husband. I'm feeling angry after the death of whomever. Why am I feeling angry? I was able to communicate my feelings of anger. And if you're feeling anger, it is okay. However, you need to acknowledge the anger, number one. And number two, you need to acknowledge, why are you angry? What specifically or who specifically are you angry at? Because if you do not address the source of your anger, the fact that you're feeling anger, then it could potentially turn into complicated grief. So again, it's okay to feel anger. However, you need to be honest about why you feel angry, who you feel angry with. Okay. And that comes with just being honest about this journey of grief and the different emotions that you will feel. The third feeling that is completely normal when you are grieving is the feeling of blame. Okay. And this is the line of reasoning or the psychology behind blame when you're grieving, is that if someone can be blamed, then that person is responsible. If someone can be blamed, then that person is responsible, and hence the loss could have been prevented. So it's kind of like a protection mechanism when you're feeling blame and you feel like you have someone that you can blame it on. It kind of makes you feel a little bit better about the loss. Okay. So you may blame the physician or the hospital. I remember when my late husband died, they had to do an autopsy because there were a lot of unanswered questions, and the conclusion was that he should not have died. Okay, so there was some blame towards the hospital. Like, why weren't you guys able to save him? He had been here for this same thing before years ago. And, this hospital is known for this. Like, why weren't you all able to save him and help him? So there was a level of blame. So if you are grieving and you are blaming, you may blame the physician or the hospital. You may blame the funeral director. You may blame certain family members. You may blame an insensitive friend. And for those of you who are believers, you may blame God. It may be a very real feeling that you're blaming God. Like, God, you could have stopped this death from happening. God, I prayed against this, but the person still died. So that's a very real thing, to be blaming people when you are experiencing the grief or the loss. Now, in terms of blame, you may feel cheated, but you may be confused as to who you feel cheated by. Do you feel cheated by God? Do you feel cheated by the hospital, the physicians that could have saved him? Do you feel cheated by the person who died? Like, do you blame them for dying? Do you feel like they kind of gave up on life? These are very real things, very real emotions. And you may question if it's fair or not. And there's typically two types of blame that are commonly seen in grief. Number one is blaming the deceased. Typically, you experience more anger and other symptoms in the early months after the death, and you have fewer connections and continuing bonds with the person who died when you actually blame them. The second one is blaming yourself. This is typically experienced. You typically experience more grief symptoms of all kind, and you've had or you're having difficulty accepting the reality of the loss. And you may tend to keep the possessions of the deceased, and you may tend to hold on to guilt that keeps you connected to the deceased, rather than holding on to good memories as a way of continuing a healthy attachment with the memory of the person. The fourth feeling, which is completely normal, is guilt and self-reproach. When we talk about reproach, I always think about in the Bible when it speaks specifically to widows. I keep mentioning that my late husband died. I am widowed. I've been widowed for quite some time. And there's a scripture in the Bible that tells widows to specifically not remember their shame or their reproach anymore. Reproach is a type of shame, okay? It's a type of shame. It's a type of just not a really good feeling, where you feel kind of like an outcast, and you feel like something shouldn't have happened, but it did happen, and you don't really know how to move forward with it. So guilt and self-reproach, that's the fourth one. And that's self-blame, shame, and guilt, which are common experiences of the bereaved, and this can affect grief outcomes. For example, you may feel guilty that you were not kind enough to the person. You may have gotten into an argument with the person right before they died, and you may feel guilty that, the last conversation you had with them, it was not a nice conversation. Number two, you may feel guilty for not taking the person to the hospital soon enough. Now, when I'm teaching, when I'm educating, I like to share parts of my story because I connect when I hear other people's stories. So when my late husband, when he was getting sick, I literally took him to the hospital on a Saturday, and less than 24 hours on a Sunday, he had died. And I remember at the time, my youngest daughter, she was only 4 at the time. And when children are experiencing a death or a loss, and especially if it's a death of a parent, they're very black and white at that age. When they're little, like 4 years old, they're very, very black and white. So I remember my baby girl, she kept saying, and she wasn't being malicious or mean, she was being a 4-year-old trying to process the death of her father. She kept saying, Mommy, if you would have took Daddy to a different hospital, he wouldn't have died. She didn't mean any harm. But in my mind, I had already been thinking, like, if I would have gotten him to the hospital sooner, like, because it was a very traumatic experience, just getting him to the hospital, him dying and all of that. But I kept saying, I wonder if I would have gotten him to the hospital sooner, like, would he have lived? So that's a very real feeling of guilt and self-reproach, and feeling like you weren't kind enough. You didn't get the person to the hospital soon enough. You didn't notice that they were in pain or that they were in distress soon enough. But most often, the guilt of the death of the person is irrational. And you can work through that when we do something that we do in counseling and therapy called reality testing. So you can work through those feelings of guilt and self-reproach. Next is anxiety. Number 5 is anxiety. This can range from a light sense of insecurity to a strong panic attack. The more intense and persistent the anxiety, the more it suggests that you may be leaning into an abnormal grief reaction. So anxiety comes primarily from two sources. Number 1, it comes from attachment related anxiety. And when we talk about attachment, we talk about, like, we're talking about how attached you were to the person. What was your relationship? Is this a person who was in your day-to-day, everyday life, like a husband, a wife, a child? So attachment related anxiety is the fear that the survivor, the person who's grieving, you who are grieving, the fear that the survivor won't be able to take care of him or herself after the death of the person. And you may frequently comment, I won't be able to survive without him or her. I do a lot of work with widows. I talk to widows often, and that's a common thought process of some widows, especially widows who were married to their husband for 20 plus years and their lives were literally mended together. I can't survive without this person. How am I going to live without them? How am I going to do, just basic normal things that I depended on them for without them? The second type of anxiety is personal death awareness, which is the awareness of one's own mortality, which is increased by the death of a loved one. I remember in the beginning stages of my grief, there were certain people where it seemed like they kind of avoided me and they didn't want to be around me. And it was strange at first. I didn't get offended, but then I believe the Lord began to give me revelation that sometimes when people see other people close to them and they experience like a death, it can make them face their own mortality. It can make them face the fact that none of us are going to make it out of here alive. So that can create a sense of anxiety. That can create a sense of like isolation when one is going through grief. Now, in extreme cases of anxiety, it can develop into a full-blown phobia. And there was this famous author, he wrote many books long ago. His name was C.S. Lewis, and he actually was a widower. He experienced the death of his wife. And he talked about this anxiety that can be so harsh and so heavy that it turns into a phobia. And one of the quotes that he said after losing his wife, he said, quote, "No one ever told me that grief felt so much like fear. I am not afraid, but the sensation is like feeling afraid. The same fluttering in the stomach, the same restlessness, the yawning, I keep on swallowing." So he was expressing just those feelings of anxiety that can come along with the death of a person. The next feeling, number 6, is loneliness. And this is a feeling that is frequently expressed by survivors, particularly those who have lost a spouse and who were used to having a close day-to-day relationship with the person. The two main types of loneliness that you may experience are, number 1, emotional loneliness, and then number 2, social loneliness. The next feeling is fatigue. Number 7 is fatigue, which is a totally normal grief feeling. And the fatigue that you may feel is often experienced as a feeling of apathy or listlessness. And what apathy is, it's a lack of interest, it's a lack of enthusiasm, it's a lack of concern. You can just feel so blah, so disconnected. You could be in a room full of people and you just are feeling like you are all alone. Listlessness is a feeling of a lack of energy and enthusiasm and being unmotivated to do things. So these can be associated with feelings of fatigue when you are grieving the death or the loss of a person. Number 8 is helplessness. So this is frequently present. The feeling of helplessness is frequently present in the early stages of loss. And widows in particular often feel extremely helpless when they lose their spouse, the person who they did life with day in and day out. And the feeling of helplessness is associated with a concept and a term that is used in psychology called locus of control. And locus of control is a psychological concept that describes how much an individual believes that they have control over the events of their life. So people that have more of an external locus of control, they feel like they're at the mercy of circumstances and less able to exert a sense of control and self-efficacy. So people who deal with external locus of control, they feel like nothing is in their control, that outside circumstances, the atmosphere around them, the powers that be are controlling their fate and what happens to them. People that have more of an internal locus of control, they feel like they can control their circumstances within themselves, by themselves, and within their own power. So depending on if you are focusing on internal locus of control, you feel like you have the power to move forward when devastating things happen. You won't feel as helpless as someone who has an external locus of control, who feels like there's nothing I can do. You know, it's the powers that be, it's the atmosphere around me. I can't do anything. I'm just helpless to my environment and to my circumstances. Number 9 is shock, which occurs most often in the case of a sudden death. That's very common to sadness. Sadness and shock are very normal, very expected behaviors or feelings in grief. Number 10, and I'm almost finished. Thank you for those of you who are hanging out with me. Number 10 is yearning, a sense of yearning. This is commonly experienced among widows and survivors. When the yearning feeling diminishes, it may be a sign that mourning is coming to an end. Now, there's a difference between grief, mourning, and bereavement, and I talked about that in a few videos back. But when the yearning starts to diminish and kind of go away, that's a sign that the mourning process is coming to an end. And just to give you like a tip, mourning is more outward. It's an outward expression of the sadness that you feel with the death and the loss of a person. Grief is more internal. So when yearning doesn't come to an end, and when yearning goes on for an extended period of time, it may be a clinical sign that it's turning into complicated grief. Number 11 is emancipation. Some people feel emancipation after the death of a person. Now, they may not want to share this with other people, but emancipation is a normal feeling that some people experience after the death of a person. Emancipation can be a positive feeling after death. It could be a feeling of relief and freedom after the death of a person due to the nature of the relationship. For example, if someone was in an abusive marriage and their spouse died, they may feel a feeling of emancipation after that person dies. Another example, if a child was in an abusive relationship with their parent, whether it was a physically abusive relationship or an emotionally and mentally abusive relationship with their parent, and that parent dies, they may feel a sense of emancipation. They may feel a sense of freedom. They may feel a sense of relief, okay? People may not think this is a normal feeling associated with grief, but it is. The person who may be feeling this type of emancipation and freedom as a result of the death of a person, they may feel like they can't really share this with anyone. But if you are watching this video on the replay and someone in your life has died and you feel a sense of relief, a sense of freedom, a sense of emancipation because of the nature of the relationship, I want you to know that that's a normal feeling, okay? That's a normal grief feeling. Number 12 is relief. Many people feel relief after the death of a loved one. Now, this may not have to do with like an abusive relationship. Some people are grieving people that are still alive. When I say that, I mean, like I have a close friend whose mother has dementia. There's other people who have watched their parents suffer with illnesses. I was on the phone with someone yesterday and they were sharing that one of their parents passed away after suffering an illness for years and years and years. And basically when that happens, people are experiencing anticipatory grief. They're kind of like grieving while the person is still alive. So relief comes in when someone has watched their loved one suffer with an illness for many, many years. If it was a lengthy illness or a painful illness and the person dies, sometimes they feel relief because their loved one is no longer in physical pain. Their loved one is no longer suffering. Their loved one no longer has to, be in pain every day or worry about the stressors of this world. So relief in many instances can be a normal feeling of grief after someone has died. And this can also occur when the death involves a person with whom the mourner has had a particularly difficult and often lifelong relationship. And then the last feeling of normal grief is numbness, like completely numb, not feeling anything. Some people report a lack of feelings after the death of a person. After loss, they feel numb. This is typically experienced early in the grieving process, usually right after the person learns of the death. And this probably occurs because there are so many feelings to deal with that to allow all of those feelings to come into consciousness would be overwhelming. So it's a bit of a defense mechanism so that the person experiencing the numbness as a protection from this flood of feelings does not become just unusually overwhelmed. So I just want you to know that this list represents normal feelings of grief. However, feelings that exist for abnormally long periods of time and at excessive intensities, they may be a sign of complicated grief. Okay. So thank you so much for tuning in. This was a pretty exhaustive list of the normal feelings that you may feel if you are grieving the death of a person, if you are grieving the loss of someone or something. Thank you so much for those of you who tuned in live. Thank you for those of you who will be watching this on the replay. If you got value from this video, if this is a topic that you are interested in, if you are on a personal grief and healing and wellness journey, I want you to like this video. I want you to drop me a comment, and I want you to subscribe. If you are on a personal grief and healing journey and you want help, I want you to go to my website, pathwayforjoy.com. When you go onto my website, number one, if you sign up for my email list, you can get a free Right to Heal 3-day healing challenge. This is a virtual challenge that will take you through 3 days of embarking on the journey of grieving and healing. Now, grief and healing is a lifelong journey. There's no way that you can heal within 3 days. However, this virtual challenge is going to help you to take the first step to go into the direction of embracing your grief, creating space for your grief, and embarking on the lifelong journey of healing. So when you go to my website, pathwayforjoy.com, you can sign up for the free Right to Heal 3-day healing challenge. It'll be delivered directly to your inbox. Now, secondly, if you are a person who feels like you may be interested in doing your grief counseling and your inner healing work with me, as I am a certified grief counselor and inner healing and wellness coach, I want you to also go to my website and I want you to learn more about my 30-minute discovery call. You can schedule a 30-minute discovery call with me to share your story so that we can determine if we're a good fit to work together, and I can guide you along the journey of grieving and healing. So thank you so much for tuning in. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you to those who will catch this on the replay. Drop me a comment, like, and subscribe to the channel. And thank you so much. Have a good one, guys and girls.